Hi, welcome back to the Story Lady. Today we're going to be finishing up The Mouse and the Motorcycle. Let's begin. Chapter 11, The Search. I have to go out into the hotel, Ralph informed his relatives. I've got to help the boy. Oh no, not out in the hotel, cried Ralph's mother. Not while the housekeeper is looking for mice. If you're seen, we'll all be in danger. I'll be back before dawn, said Ralph staunchly. I must go. Don't try to stop me. See here, my boy, aren't you being a bit dramatic? Asked Uncle Lester. Whatever do you have to go out into the hotel for? To pilfer a pill, said Ralph. An aspirin tablet. His answer was dramatic enough even for Uncle Lester. His entire family stared at him in disbelief. Not an aspirin, not after his own father had been poisoned by one of the dreaded tablets. An aspirin? Ralph's mother gasped. No, Ralph, not that. Anything but that. It is the only way. Ralph stood tall and brave. The boy has a fever and he needs an aspirin. I'm going to find him one. Oh, Ralph! His mother hid her face in her paws. But Ralph, quavered Aunt Sissy, remember your father. You can't carry an aspirin in your cheek pouches. It would poison you. How could you get one here? I'll find a way. Ralph was outwardly steadfast in his determination, but inside he wondered how he would manage to get an aspirin into room 215 if he did not find one. Roll it, perhaps. If he did find one, roll it, perhaps. Ralph, stay here, pleaded his mother. You're too young. Let your Uncle Lester go. Well, now, let's talk this over, said Uncle Lester. I'm not too young, and I haven't a moment to lose. Ralph, who was really frightened by what he was about to do, also enjoyed the drama of the moment. Goodbye. I shall return before dawn. Ralph, promise me you'll be careful, pleaded his mother. Promise me you won't climb into suitcases like Aunt Adrienne. Ralph's Aunt Adrienne, who liked nice things, had climbed into a suitcase to examine a nylon stocking. Someone had closed the suitcase, and Aunt Adrienne had never been seen again. It was hoped she had been carried away to a life of luxury. Promise me, Ralph, cried his mother, but her son was already on his way out the knothole. Ralph scurried across the carpet of room 215, flattened himself, and squeezed under the door. Once out in the hall, his courage ebbed. The aspirin tablet seemed a very small thing to find in such a vast place. It would be much easier to find the motorcycle. No, thought Ralph, I must not even think about the motorcycle. Ralph began to feel pretty small himself, much smaller than he had felt during his show of bravery back in the mouse nest. Down in the lobby, a clock struck 1. There was not a moment to lose. He ran to the next room, squeezed under the door, and searched under the beds and the dresser while 2 guests slept soundly. All he found was a bobby pin. He skipped room 211 because his enemy, the little terrier, was still there, and ran on to room 209. A hurried search, frightening because of the loud and uneven snores that came from one of the beds, revealed nothing but a few pretzel crumbs, which Ralph did not have time to eat. On and on ran Ralph, down the hall, under the doors, around under beds and dressers. There was not a single aspirin tablet to be found. In one of the rooms, he did see a penny that had rolled under a luggage rack, and remembered his mother's wish to leave a tip for room service. But tonight he had no time for pennies. He must press on and find an aspirin. A small doubt began to creep into Ralph's thoughts as he ran down the hall to the last room on the 2nd floor. Maybe there was no aspirin. Maybe he was risking his life and the lives of his family for nothing. But Ralph pushed the thought aside. He would not let himself become discouraged. If there was no aspirin on the 2nd floor, there had to be one someplace on the ground floor. Tonight he was willing to brave the stairs to find it. He flattened himself and squeezed under the last door on the 2nd floor. There was nothing under either of the beds but the things Keith called dust mice. There was no sound but the rattle of the windows and the wind. Ralph started across the carpet toward the dresser when suddenly a light from the bedside table blinded him. He stopped rooted to the carpet by fear, even though it was not likely that anyone was going to cut off his tail with a carving knife. He heard someone slip out of bed and utter a sound halfway between a squeal and a scream. But before Ralph knew what was happening, an ordinary drinking glass had been clapped down over him, and there he stood in a glass trap. By then his eyes were adjusted to the light, and he found himself facing a pair of bare feet. Looking up, he saw that the feet belonged to a young woman in a pink nightgown. "Mary Lou, wake up," she whispered to the young woman in the other bed. "Look what I've caught." "Huh?" said Mary Lou, blinking and raising up on one elbow. Her hair was done up on pink rollers. "Betty, are you out of your mind? It must be past 1 o'clock in the morning." The night was slipping by much too quickly for the trapped mouse. He was terrified and he was desperate. No one in his family had ever been trapped under a drinking glass before. Worst of all, he was failing Keith and endangering his family. "Wake up, Mary Lou, and look," insisted Betty. I was getting up to stop the rattle in the window and caught a mouse. This news roused Mary Lou from bed, and the two young women knelt on the carpet to look at Ralph, who promptly turned his back. He did not care to be stared at in his misery, but it was no use. The woman moved around to the other side of the glass. "Isn't he darling?" said Betty. "Just look at his cunning little paws." Mary Lou leaned closer for a better look. "And his little ears. Aren't they sweet?" Betty was delighted. It was disgusting. It was bad enough to be trapped and stared at, but to have this pair carrying on in such a gushy fashion was almost more than Ralph could stomach. Cunning little paws indeed. They were strong paws, paws for grasping, the hand grips of a motorcycle. "Oh, Betty, do you suppose we could take him back to Wichita with us?" asked Mary Lou. "My third grade would love him." "So would my kindergarten," agreed Betty. "We could keep him in a cage on the ledge, and all the children could bring him food from home. It would be such a good experience for them to have a pet in the classroom." "Well," thought Ralph grimly, "I always wanted to travel." A cage in a kindergarten in Wichita, however, was not exactly the destination he had in mind. The minutes were slipping by dangerously fast. He had to do something. "Look," he shouted through the glass in desperation. "Let me go. Please let me go. There's something terribly important I've got to do." "He squeaked," marveled Betty. "He's adorable," squealed Mary Lou. It was no use. Young women could not speak his language. Ralph was in despair. He thought of Keith tossing feverishly in his bed, and of his family huddled in the mouse nest waiting for his safe return. "But I don't see how we could take him back to Wichita," said Betty sensibly. "We're driving to San Francisco and then to Disneyland before we start back. How could we carry him thousands of miles?" The two teachers looked thoughtfully at Ralph, who knew his fate depended on their decision. Was he to be carried to Disneyland and eventually to a ledge in a kindergarten room in Wichita? Or would they let him go? A third possibility crossed Ralph's mind. Perhaps they would leave him under the glass for the housekeeper to see. He hoped not. He did not think he could last that long. Already the inside of the glass was beginning to feel warm and airless. "I suppose we really shouldn't turn him loose in the hotel," said Mary Lou. "Mice are pests, even if they are cute." The teacher not only destroyed Ralph's hopes, she hurt his feelings as well, calling him a pest when he was on an errand of mercy. From the mouse's point of view, the teachers were the pest. "I know," exclaimed Betty suddenly, causing Ralph to look over his shoulder for a clue to what it was she knew. "I know how we can get rid of him without hurting him." The young teacher reached over to the bedside table, where she picked up a picture postcard. She slid it carefully under the glass and under Ralph's feet, so that he was now standing on a postcard. He noticed the picture was of a giant redwood tree, the same postcard all travelers bought when they came to California. "Now what are you going to do?" asked Mary Lou. "Watch." Betty carefully lifted the postcard, Ralph and the glass, and walked across the room. Even though he knew it was useless, Ralph scrabbled around in his tiny prison. He was afraid she was taking him toward the wash basin. He had heard of mice being drowned by people who did not like traps. The teacher walked not to the wash basin, but to the open window. She held Ralph across the sill, removed the postcard from the glass, and gave it a little jerk that shook Ralph off into the vines that grew up at the side of the building. "There," she said, and closed the window, leaving Ralph clinging to a vine high above the ground. Chapter 12. An Errand of Mercy. "Owls," thought Ralph as he clung to the Virginia creeper and filled his lungs with the cool night air that was such a relief after the stuffy drinking glass. "I've always wanted to climb down this vine and explore the ground floor," he reminded himself grimly, "and now I have to." Ralph had never before been outdoors beneath the moon and the stars. He felt small and frightened and alone. Slowly, paw over paw, he worked his way along the shoots and tendrils. An owl, uncomfortably close in a pine tree, hooted, and Ralph huddled shivering in the shadow of a leaf, aware that he was losing precious seconds. A night wind rattled the windows, and the owl glided off across the parking lot. Ralph inched his way down the vine. It was a long, winding route full of detours to the ground floor window, which, to Ralph's relief, was open. Upon reaching the sill, Ralph leaped to the floor of the room, in which 3 young men of college age were sleeping, 2 in bed and 1 in a sleeping bag on the floor. "An aspirin. I must find an aspirin," thought Ralph. Darting under the bed, he bumped into a dust mouse, which startled him, but he did not find an aspirin. He was in such a hurry he ran right over the man in the sleeping bag instead of taking time to go around. There, under the dresser, gleaming in a shaft of moonlight, he saw a round white pill. He went closer. Yes, it really was an aspirin tablet. At last, Ralph was positive it was an aspirin and not some other pill, because it had letters stamped on it. Ralph could not read the letters, but he knew they stood for an aspirin. He had been warned about them often enough. Now all Ralph had to do was figure out how to get the pill upstairs to room 215. Telling himself that in spite of all that had happened that night, it could not be much past 1 o'clock in the morning. Ralph, half pushed and half-rolled the aspirin tablet around the man in the sleeping bag to the door. He shoved it under the door and with great difficulty squeezed under himself. The first floor carpet was thicker and of better quality than that of the second floor. Ralph worked his way with the aspirin down the hall to the lobby, where the night clerk was asleep on a couch. The glassy eyes of deer heads mounted on the knotty pine walls seemed to stare at Ralph. So did the giant eye of the television set. Slowly he moved his precious load across the lobby to the stairs, and there he stopped. How could he manage to get that aspirin up those stairs? He picked it up and tried lifting it, even though he knew he could not reach the first step with it. The night clerk tossed on the couch and made a gobbling, snorting noise. Ralph dropped the aspirin in a panic and looked wildly about for a hiding place. With one terrified leap, he dived under the grandfather clock between the elevator and the stairs. It was immediately plain from the dust that no one ever cleaned under the clock. Ralph struggled to control his sneeze. Above him, the works of the clock began to make grinding noises. Achoo! This sneeze could not be held back. Bong! The clock struck 1:30, forcing Ralph to clap his hands over his ears. How his famous ancestor, the one that ran up the clock, Hickory-Dickory-Dock, stood the racket he did not know. Peeking out, Ralph discovered the night clerk had slept soundly through the din, so he ventured out from under the clock to continue his struggle with the aspirin tablet. Since carrying the pill up the stairs was impossible, Ralph had to find another way. The elevator? Ridiculous. A mouse could not run an elevator. Then quite unexpectedly, a whole plan of action popped into his mind. Ralph had a genius inspiration. First, he rolled the aspirin to a safe place behind the ashtray, stand beside the elevator. Then, empty-potted, he climbed the stairs to the second floor and ran down the hall to room 215, where he squeezed under the door. Keith was still half awake, his eyes glinting with fever under their heavy lids. Psst, said Ralph. I found an aspirin for you. Murmured Keith. An aspirin tablet. I found an aspirin. Where is it? Keith was more awake now. Down on the first floor. Oh, Keith was obviously disappointed. Now wait, said Ralph. I can get it up here, but I've got to have some help. You'll have to let me take your sports car. You're too young, mumbled Keith. I am not, and it was true that Ralph felt very much older than he had when he lost the motorcycle. Come on, you need that aspirin, don't you? You already lost my motorcycle. Oh, come on. Ralph was growing more impatient as he felt the night slipping by. If you won't let me take the sports car, will you let me take the ambulance? I guess so. Keith did not feel equal to arguing with a determined mouse. He picked up his ambulance from the bedside table and set it on the floor. Here. One more thing, said Ralph anxiously. Do you think you can manage to open the door for me? I know you feel terrible, but it is the last thing I'll ask. Honest, and I promise I'll have the aspirin up here in no time. Keith sighed, but he slid his feet out from under the sheet and, hanging on to the bedside table, reached over and opened the door. Ralph was already seated in the white ambulance with the red cross painted on the side. Wee, wee, wee! He took the corner into the hall on 2 wheels and sped down the bare floor between the wall and the carpet until he came to room 211. Here he slowed down and then went, wee, 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 good and loud. This carried him, as he had planned, to the elevator. It was a crucial moment. Now he would find out if his plan was going to work. The little dog in room 211 began to whimper, and then to bark just as Ralph had planned. In a moment, the door opened and the man stumbled out with the little terrier in his arms. Oh, all right, he grumbled. I'll walk you. Shut up, will you? Ralph waited, his paws tense on the steering wheel. The man walked groggily to the closed elevator door, where he managed, in spite of the wriggling dog in his arms, to push the button. Soon the elevator door slid open. Ralph knew that timing was important. The man entered the elevator. The dog barked. Wee, wee, said Ralph, hard enough and fast enough to shoot the ambulance at great speed across the yawning crack between the floor of the hall and the floor of the elevator before the man turned around. As the dog's owner turned, Ralph stared skillfully around his feet and parked the ambulance behind him. The man pressed the button, the doors closed, and the elevator actually began to descend. Do you know what you are? The man sleepily asked the dog. You are a nuisance. That's what you are, a 4-footed, hair-covered nuisance. The dog ignored his master. I know you're down there, he yapped to Ralph. If I could just get down, I'd get you. Ralph did not answer. He was taking no chances. He waited quietly inside his ambulance until the man had carried the dog out before he drove out of the elevator. He jumped out of the ambulance, opened the rear doors, seized the precious aspirin, and boosted it inside. Slamming the doors, he ran around and jumped into the driver's seat. There was not an instant to lose. Wee, wee! The ambulance moved toward the open elevator, but unfortunately by this time Ralph was slightly out of breath. The front wheels of the ambulance caught in the crack between the floor of the lobby and the floor of the elevator. The ambulance was stuck. Oh no, thought Ralph. Not now. I can't fail now. Wee, wee, he managed to gasp. The wheels spun, but the ambulance did not move. Ralph jumped out, put his shoulder to the rear of the vehicle, and pushed with all his strength. Nothing happened. In a moment, the man would be returning with his dog. Desperate, Ralph climbed back into the ambulance. He took a breath so deep he thought his lungs would surely burst. Wee, wee, wee! He made the sound hard and fast and high-pitched. The wheels spun. The ambulance moved slowly at first, and then as the tires got a grip on the floor of the elevator, it shot out of the crack and across the elevator and hit the rear wall with a bump. Ralph collapsed over the steering wheel, limp with relief, just as the man came back through the lobby with his dog. I guess some boy lost his toy ambulance, muttered the man, more awake now as he stepped in and pressed the button. Toy, thought Ralph indignantly. This ambulance is carrying medical supplies to the sick. Boy, my foot, yapped the terrier. It's that dastardly mouse. Let me down and I'll get him. Ralph did not try to answer. He was saving all his breath now to get the ambulance across that crack once more. The man slapped the dog lightly on the nose and said, Be quiet. I took you outside, didn't I? Fortunately, the elevator door stayed open behind the man as he walked out, so Ralph had no trouble driving the ambulance out and down the hall to room 215. The door had blown shut, but he did not care. He jumped out of the ambulance and ran around to the back, where he unloaded the aspirin, shoved it under the bedroom door, and squeezed under after it. Hey, Keith, I've got it, Ralph was filled with triumph. I brought you an aspirin. Chapter 13, A Subject for a Composition. Ralph was a hero in the mouse hole that night. His admiring relatives gathered around, begging to hear the story of his adventures. Ralph could not help bragging a little as he told the story of his travels, beginning with the search of the second-floor rooms, skipping the part about the teacher trapping him under a drinking glass, and ending with Keith's taking the aspirin and finally falling asleep. But are you sure it really was an aspirin tablet? Ralph's mother could always find something to worry about. Are you sure it wasn't some other kind of pill? Keith put it on the bedside table and refused to take it until his mother saw it, explained Ralph. At first, his mother and father got pretty excited and thought he was out of his mind from the fever when he started telling them that there was an aspirin on the table. Then when they saw the pill and could tell from the letters on it that it really was an aspirin, they decided the night clerk must have found it and brought it up. They thought the windows rattled so much they did not hear his knock. Oh, Ralph, I'm so proud of you, said his mother with a sigh of relief, while his brothers and sisters and cousins stared at him with shining eyes. Good work, Ralph. I didn't think you could do it, said Uncle Lester heartily. I feel much better about room service now that we have left an aspirin for a tip, said Ralph's mother. I feel that at last we have done the right thing. Our Ralph is growing up, said Aunt Sissy. Yes, Ralph is growing up, agreed his mother, with a sad note in her voice. It's hard to believe. It seems only yesterday that he was a tiny pink mouse without any hair. Naturally, this embarrassed Ralph, but now that his mother had finally admitted he was growing up, he decided to make the most of this moment. Now can I go down to the first floor by myself? He asked eagerly. We'll see, said his mother, looking worried once more. Nonsense, said Uncle Lester. Of course he may go. Ralph has shown that he can be a very responsible mouse. I guess you're right, agreed Ralph's mother nervously. Oh, boy, exclaimed Ralph. Tell us again how you climbed down the vine and the owl nearly got you, begged a cousin. No, tell us again how the ambulance got stuck in the crack, said another. No, tell the part about how you got the dog to bark, pleaded a third. The only flaw in the evening for Ralph was the fact that he had not found the motorcycle on his travels through the hotel. Keith slept soundly, and the next morning, although he still had a temperature, Ralph was pleased to see he was feeling much better. Do you hurt any place? Mrs. Gridley asked anxiously after she had given her son an aspirin brought by the milkman. Is your throat sore? Does your stomach ache? Keith shook his head. I just feel sort of tired. He's going to be all right. He must have picked up a bug someplace, said Mrs. Gridley to her husband. A day in bed with plenty of fluids, and he'll be on his feet again. Mr. Gridley nodded. Do you feel like eating any breakfast? He asked Keith. We can order something for you from room service. Keith brightened. Can I really have something sent up from room service? He asked, and when his father assured him he could, he slumped back into the pillow. But I'm not hungry. Some orange juice would be good for you, suggested his mother. All right, agreed Keith, and then added as if he suddenly had an inspiration, and bacon and toast and jelly. Your appetite seems to have come back in a hurry, remarked Mr. Gridley, as he picked up the telephone and asked to be connected with room service to order. He thought breakfast for his son. As soon as the adults had gone, Ralph popped out into the room. Hi, said Keith. Thanks a lot for the aspirin. It really helped. That's all right, answered Ralph modestly. Where did you find it? Keith was curious to know. Under a dresser down on the first floor. The first floor? Keith did not believe it. How did you manage to get it up here? Once more, Ralph told the story of his night's adventure, skipping the part about the drinking glass, but making it sound as if he had narrowly escaped the horny talons of the owl as he traveled down the vine. Golly, Keith was amazed at Ralph's story. You know what? You're a pretty smart mouse, and a brave one, too. It was nothing, said Ralph in an offhand manner. Nothing. It was plenty. You risked your life. The boy's admiration and gratitude made Ralph feel even prouder of what he had done. I parked your ambulance out in the hall, he said, wanting Keith to know how responsible he was. Your folks will probably see it and bring it in when they come back. That reminds me, you didn't happen to see my motorcycle anyplace, did you? Keith's question was unexpected. Well, no, I didn't, Ralph suddenly felt less proud of himself, but I didn't have much time to look. Yeah, I know, Keith was sympathetic. I just wondered. A knock at the door sent Ralph scurrying into the knothole. Come in, called Keith. Matt entered with a tray. Here you are, and here is your ambulance. I found it out in the hall, he said as he set the tray across Keith's knees. Sorry to see you're under the weather. Thank you. I'll be all right. Keith handed Matt a coin his father had left for a tip. And thanks for bringing in my ambulance. Matt pocketed the coin. Thank you, he said. And by the way, this doesn't happen to be yours, does it? He pulled the little motorcycle out of his pocket. Ralph was so excited he almost fell out of the knothole. Hey, Keith sat up straight, rocking the orange juice on his tray. It sure is. Where did you find it? In a hamper of linen that had been chewed by mice, or by a mouse. It fell out when the housekeeper was showing us the damage that had been done. I picked it up before anyone noticed it. Gee, thanks. Thanks a lot. Keith accepted the motorcycle and set it on his tray. It's my favorite. I didn't like losing it. I wonder how it got into the hamper of linen, Matt mused. Keith grinned but said nothing. Old Matt rubbed his chin and stared at the ceiling. I don't suppose a certain irresponsible mouse happened to ride it into a pile of sheets and pillowcases and get tangled up and dumped into the hamper. Keith tried not to laugh. I don't know any irresponsible mice, he said. Only one responsible mouse. Say, how did you guess? There isn't much around this hotel that escapes my attention, said Matt. I saw that mouse out in the hall with the little motorcycle. I imagine he's a regular speed demon. Ralph could no longer stay out of the conversation. I'm fast, but I'm careful. I haven't had an accident yet, he boasted and added hastily, recalling his fall into the wastebasket. At least not since I learned to ride the motorcycle. If there's anything I can't stand, it's a cheeky mouse, remarked Matt good-naturedly. What do you call getting tangled up in a lot of linen? What I mean is I didn't crack up in the motorcycle, said Ralph with dignity. He's not cheeky, defended Keith. He's brave. You aren't going to tell the management about him, are you? What's the use, said Matt. If they get rid of these mice, more will move in. Anyway, he's a cute little fellow. It cheers me up just to think of him tearing around on a little motorcycle. If only I could, thought Ralph. There followed an unusually pleasant day for the mice. Keith stuffed the bacon and toast and jelly through the knothole. The mice feasted on the bacon and jelly before the ants could get at them, and stored the toast against the rapidly approaching time when Keith must leave the hotel. They slept all morning while Keith alternately napped and played with his cars. For lunch, they enjoyed peanut butter sandwiches again. Ralph did not sleep well that afternoon. He found himself thinking of the tantalizing glimpses he had had of the ground floor and of all the opportunities it offered mice. Crumbs in the dining room, leftovers in the kitchen, scraps in the garbage. He lay daydreaming on a pile of shredded Kleenex. He could see himself on the first floor, pilfering crumbs in the dining room at night after the guests were in bed. And from the dining room he could go to the kitchen right past the night clerk, who was sure to be asleep. If only he could make the trip on the motorcycle. The thought of the motorcycle put an end to Ralph's daydream and made his sleep impossible. After tossing about on his bed of Kleenex, he got up and poked his head out of the knothole. Keith was awake, lying back on the pillows with his cars beside him. He smiled wanly at Ralph. How are you feeling? Asked Ralph. Sort of tired, answered Keith. Ralph climbed through the hole. Where are your folks? They went out for a little while. They'll be back. I'm supposed to take a nap. Are you going to? Asked Ralph. I'd rather talk to you. Keith leaned over and set the motorcycle on the floor. Want to ride it? He asked. Do I want to ride it? Ralph could scarcely believe he had heard correctly. You mean you'll let me, after the way I lost it for you? You proved you could be responsible when you brought me the aspirin, explained Keith. You're more grown up. Thanks, said Ralph modestly. I guess mice grow up faster than boys, Keith sounded as though he longed to grow up rapidly as a mouse. You grow a little bit every day, Ralph said as he removed his crash helmet from its hiding place behind the curtain. I guess you're right, agreed Keith. My dad measures me every 6 months against the door jamb of our kitchen back in Ohio, and each mark he makes is higher than the last, but I never feel myself growing. You wait long enough and you will be a grown-up. Ralph felt as if he had said something very wise as he slipped the rubber band on his crash helmet around his whiskers. I guess so. Keith slumped back on the pillows. But it takes so long. I grew up, didn't I? Asked Ralph. You said yourself I had become a responsible mouse. Yes, you did, said Keith thoughtfully. I guess that's part of the secret. Just getting bigger isn't enough. You have to learn things like not taking off down a steep hill on a bicycle when you aren't used to handbrakes. Stuff like that. Ralph walked with a slight swagger to the motorcycle, grabbed the hand grips, and threw his leg across the seat. He remembered to pick up his tail before he started. Pop. He took off across the carpet and circled the room, covering the rough parts under the dresser and chair, and coming to a halt beside the bed. She has good balance on a rough road, said Ralph with authority. She's a mighty fine machine. Say, Ralph, said Keith, suddenly sitting up, how would you like to come with me when we leave the hotel? Come with you? Ralph was stunned. He had expected to live and die in the Mountain View Inn, and now he's being offered the opportunity for travel that he had dreamed of. Yes, come with me to San Francisco and then back to Ohio. Ralph's first thought was of the motorcycle. If he went with Keith, he would not have to be separated from the motorcycle. Keith must have sensed Ralph's thoughts, because he said, you could ride the motorcycle every day. Ralph was silent. He had begun to think of other things, his family, the permission he had earned to visit the ground floor, Keith's family and how they might feel about a mouse. Come on, Ralph, said Keith. You could travel in my pocket. Your mother doesn't care for mice, Ralph pointed out. Not running around loose, agreed Keith, but she let me keep a couple of white mice once. I still have their cage at home. You would be very comfortable in it. Comfortable in a cage? Ralph was horrified. No, thank you. Aw, come on. Would you like to be shut up in a cage? Demanded Ralph. Well, no, but neither would I, said Ralph, especially now that I can finally go to the ground floor. In his disappointment, Keith slumped back on the pillows once more. I guess I knew you really wouldn't want to come, he said. I understand. I sure will hate to see this motorcycle leave, said Ralph, and added hastily, and you too, of course. The boy and the mouse were silent. Both were thinking of their wishes and the regrets that their wishes could not come true. Keith rolled over on his side and propped his head up on his fist. Would you like to keep the motorcycle, he asked. Keep it? Me? Sure, said Keith. I can save up my allowance and buy another one when we get back to Ohio. You really mean it? Ralph could scarcely contain his excitement. Keep it for my very own? Of course. How come? Ralph wanted to know. I just like to think of you riding it, said Keith. You know, if you grew up enough to be trusted with a mouse-sized motorcycle, maybe someday I could earn a big one. The excitement drained out of Ralph. I don't have any place to keep it. It's too big to go through the knothole, and I couldn't hide it behind the curtain forever, because I've heard that after Labor Day, when there aren't so many tourists, they take the curtains down to be cleaned. That is a problem, agreed Keith. There must be some place in a big hotel like this where you could keep a motorcycle. Ralph sat on the motorcycle thinking as hard as he could. In the closet, he couldn't get it out when the door was closed. Under the bed, eventually it would be found. How about downstairs, suggested Keith. I could carry it down for you before we leave. There must be a good hiding place down there someplace. There's that big old clock my ancestor ran up, said Ralph thoughtfully. Nobody ever cleans under it, but frankly I don't care to have it striking over my head. Keith thought a while. How about that big television set in the lobby, he asked. The noise shouldn't bother you because you would only go under it at night when everyone was asleep. Yes, Ralph was excited. That's a perfect garage. I saw it when I got the aspirin. The legs are just high enough for the motorcycle, but not quite high enough for a vacuum cleaner attachment. Then it's settled, said Keith, and then added rather sternly, Ralph thought, but first you must ask your mother. Ralph dismounted and ran to the knothole. He was gone several minutes before he returned to announce in triumph. She says I can keep the motorcycle if I promise to drive carefully and wear my crash helmet every single time I ride it. Swell! Keith was just as excited as Ralph. When we check out, I'll hide it for you while my folks are busy paying the bill. I can't thank you enough. Ralph fastened his crash helmet once more. I never thought I would have a motorcycle of my very own. Keith lay back on the pillow and smiled at the mouse mounting the motorcycle. It'll be fun thinking of you riding around that big old lobby when I'm back in Ohio this winter going to school. And when the teacher asks us to write a composition about our summer vacation, I can write about meeting a brave mouse named Ralph who rode a little motorcycle. I'll tell about your bringing the aspirin, except I'll have to call it a pill because I can't spell aspirin. Of course, the teacher won't believe it, but she'll probably say I show imagination. Ralph felt proud to think he was going to be written about in a composition in far-off Ohio. He grabbed his tail, gunned the motor, and took off, heading for the threadbare part of the carpet that made such a good speedway. Round and round he sped, faster and faster, until his whiskers blew back, and he was filled with joy of speed. He longed to wave to Keith, but he realized a good driver must keep both paws on the hand grips. He glanced up and noticed that Keith's eyes were closed. The boy had fallen asleep with a smile on his face. Excuse me. Ralph dragged his heels to brake the motorcycle, quietly parked it beside the bed, and quietly removed his crash helmet and hid it behind the curtain. He did not want to disturb the sleeping boy. Ralph could wait to ride the motorcycle. It was his to keep. That is the end. Thank you for joining us today on The Story Lady.